Well, good evening, beloved. Thankful for your presence, and I'm thankful that you have decided to be here. I know some of our number are traveling, and so we need to be keeping them in our prayers, and we also usually have some visitors that are here consistently, and they too are traveling. Before I begin, I just want to encourage everyone that if it is possible tonight to stay afterwards and really let's uplift our brother Graham, give him a hard time because he deserves it. I want us to, and I forgot my lapel mic, so I'm going to have to stay right behind the podium. But I want us to begin a two-part series this evening looking at seasonal Christianity. You know, it is a wonderful compliment for someone to say about you that you are dependable, reliable, consistent. You know, we should be reliable. We should be consistent just as God is consistent. There is no shadow of turning. There is no variation in God. That's what the book of James tells us. And so in the church, oftentimes, unfortunately, there tends to be a tendency of taking a break from Christianity, taking your foot off the gas and kind of just coasting. I've done so much, I've done this, now I need to kind of take a step back so I don't burn myself out. There's a difference between resting and taking a step back. You know, we must remember that Christianity is not a seasonal religion. It does not come and go as the seasons do. It is not sporadic. It is not undependable. It is not cold one day and hot the next, here one day and gone the next. But rather, it is a constant flow of devotion, a constant obedience to God, a constant light, burning bright for those that are in the world, that are in the community. You know, I appreciate Brother Bill Wendover leading that song, Stand Up for Jesus. Because oftentimes, when we start getting beaten back, we take a step back. When rather we need to hold our ground, stand our ground, and we need to be encouraging our young man who will be leaving us soon to stand his ground. Because though he has a good head and a good heart, he's going to be moving away, and we wish him the best, and we love him. And we want him to be successful, and we want him most of all to remain faithful and to grow, to surpass all of us in his spiritual wisdom, to surpass all of us in his spiritual dedication. You know, this evening I want us to look at 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4. Paul here is going to be writing to young Timothy. And though this is specifically toward a preacher, we can still make a principle application to all Christians. Because the first thing I want us to understand is that Christianity demands a spirit or a state of mind of readiness. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, beginning in verses 1 through 8, this is what I want us to read. I charge you, therefore, before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who will judge the living and the dead at his appearing in the kingdom. Preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but will heap up for themselves false teachers, but they will endure when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers, and they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables. But you, be watchful in all things, endure afflictions, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill the ministry. And then Paul begins to speak about how his time is slowly approaching, his time to depart. And he also understands verse 8. Finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day, and not only to me, but also all who have loved his appearing. We need to be ready for the second coming of Jesus Christ. When it will come, I can't tell you. Scriptures can't tell you. The only indication that we know, the only guarantee that we know is that no one knows. Not even the Son of Man, except for the Father. And so Paul here, he's speaking about him being a prisoner, verses 6 and 8. Verses 6 and 8, he knows that his death is imminent. And the charge of verse 2, the reason why he is charging young Timothy in this is because of verses 3 through 5. Difficult times are going to come. And we as God's people, we must be ready. A Christian must be urgent, as the ASV puts it. Instant, as the King James puts it. The Greek word here means to be ready or on hand. Almost be on your duty post. Be ready and able to defend the gospel. Be ready and able to do what you need to do as a Christian. Because as Christians, we need to have a spirit of readiness. Paul wrote this to Titus. He says to remind them to be subject to rulers and authorities, to obey. Okay, that's good and sound advice. Obey the laws of the land. Why? To be ready for every good work. You see, when we are obedient citizens, we're creating opportunities for us to teach the gospel. We're creating more time because we're not being arrested. We're not being labeled as a deviant. We're not being labeled as something that we're not. But be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one, to be peaceable, gentle, showing humility to all men. You know, as Christians, we are not only creating opportunities, but we're taking advantage of the time that we have, redeeming the time to create these opportunities. And sometimes we might need to be ready even in the middle of persecution. 1 Peter 3 and verse 15. There it says, be ready to give a defense, to give an answer for the hope that lies in you. That word, to give an answer, literally means to give a defense. An apologia. Not an apology, but a defense. You know, it's amazing that those who have obeyed the gospel have received this opportunity. And now it is our opportunity to become, in a sense, take on the apostleship of the doctrine, to be sent, to take on and to see the Great Commission, and to teach the gospel to the lost. You know, Paul was both ready and willing to do what it took to save souls. In 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 15, this is what he says. 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 15, and I will very gladly spend and be spent for your souls, through though the more abundantly I love you, the less I am loved. Paul understood that sometimes being ready to defend the gospel, being ready to preach the gospel, he was going to encounter difficulties, even from his own brethren. You know, do I become your enemy because I speak the truth? You know, as Christians, we need to be speaking the truth, even when it might step on toes. Because we're trying to prick the hearts of those that are around us. You know, Christians must be urgent, in season and out of season. That is what Paul encouraged young Timothy, be ready in season and out of season. It simply means all the time. There is no seasonal break that we get to pick. Opportune or inopportune, easy, difficult, convenient, inconvenient. It doesn't matter. We are to be faithful at all the time. It is a 7-day week, 24-hour vocation. Remember what we just studied there in Ephesians? Be worthy of the calling, the vocation by which you were called. You can take it or you can leave it. That is up to you to decide. Secondly, the nature of Christianity, not only does it demand and rely upon a state of readiness, it also demands faithfulness. Because if you're not faithful, what are you ready for? You know, Christianity is not a mere intellectual achievement. It does not begin and end here. It does not begin and end in the heart. It encompasses everything. It requires faithfulness. James 1 and verse 27 tells us that pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their times of affliction, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. That requires diligence. That requires a state of readiness, but it also faithfulness. You know, James chapter 2, 14 through 17 speaks about how that without faith or without works, faith is dead. But also, works without faith is meaningless. We need to be a faithful people. We need to be acceptable in our diligence. You know, 1 John 5 and verse 3 tells us this: for this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and they are not burdensome. You know, we need to be faithful to God. We need to ensure that we are looking at God's demands, His requirements, and doing them. Now, being a Christian and loving does involve effort. 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 3, there Paul is reminding them of how much he loves them and how he is keeping them in his prayers. And he is mindful, thoughtful of them. And he says, I remember your work of love. Your work of love. Sometimes our love, sometimes our faith needs to be worked out, needs to be seen. You know, Christianity is demanding that we have a fervor for God. Indifference, slothfulness, doing the bare minimum must never be a part of our mindset. You know, we can think about the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. The one who was given 5 talents and the one who was given 2 talents, they both doubled what they were given. But the one man who was given 1 talent, he didn't even do the bare minimum. He went and buried it. He also thought of his master in the wrong kind of light. And so that unprofitable servant was cast out into outer darkness. And recently we looked at how the weeping and gnashing of teeth, that has reference to an unprofitable and unfaithful servant of God. How that is tormenting them, that they were this close to making it to heaven, and now they find themselves in torment, and they didn't have to be there. And they are there because of unfaithfulness. Now, there in Colossians chapter 3, 23 through 24, it says, whatever you do, do it heartily unto the Lord. That word heartily means with all your gusto. You don't just throw it down. You don't just, as I call it, pencil whip it. Just do bare minimum. You do it with all your heart, with all your strength. You do it as if you're doing it unto the Lord. And when you do things unto the Lord, you do it to the very best of your ability. Even knowing that tomorrow your ability may be better. And so you need to put forth more effort. You know, the Lord demands that we love God, that we love Him with all of our soul, heart, mind, and strength. We need to be able to love God with that oomph, that gusto, that energy. You know, the Lord demands that we be hot in zeal for Him. Turn with me to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12, verses 10 through 11. Romans 12, verses 10 through 11 says, "Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love and honor, giving preference to one another, not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord." I want us just to look at those words. Not lagging in diligence, meaning not skipping a note, not skipping a beat. Knowing what you're supposed to do, but today I just don't feel like doing it. Not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit. Not letting the difficult times get you down and cause you to trip, cause you to misstep, but rather serving the Lord. Rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer. You know, every part of the Lord's work must be done with diligence and with fervor. Teaching and preaching, evangelism, attending, singing. You know, singing is an opportunity that we all can join in and do it together. But I pray that we never just go through the motions, but rather as faithful Christians, as faithful children of God, we sing with all of our heart. We sing with meaning. We sing with gusto. And we don't just mouth the words trying to get through with them. Now, Christianity is a practice demanding constant fervor in season and out of season. We never quit. Luke 9 and verse 62. We never grow weary. Galatians 6 and verse 9. Christianity is a religion of always. That is what faithfulness means. And that is what seasonal Christians have a difficult time understanding. They may show up once or twice a year. They may show up when it's convenient. But Christianity is a religion of always. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 58, "Be steadfast, immovable, always," what? "Abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain." Colossians 4 and verse 6, "Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt." You know, that requires effort, especially when you're in a heated conversation, especially when you're sick, when you're angry, when you're tired. Let your speech always be seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each other. Because back there in 1 Peter 3 and verse 15, "Be always ready to give an answer for the hope that lies in you." You know, because we are willing to impart our defense, our answer to those that are around us. So that hopefully, maybe, our faithfulness can cause someone to raise an eyebrow and ask, why? Why are we like this? Why are we behaving in such a way? Now, I want us to look at the book of Philippians. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 12, because we need to ensure that we are obedient always. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 12. "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to do His good pleasure." That is what we need to be doing. We need to be ensuring that we are laboring for the Lord, that we are working for the Lord in season and out of season. Verse 14 of Colossians chapter 2, or of Philippians chapter 2, "Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights. We looked at the book of Ephesians this morning in Bible class, how light exposes darkness. And we spoke about how, yes, the Word of God is a light, and it exposes the darkness of this world. But also we as Christians, instead of walking around and living our lives as children of disobedience, we are children of light, and thus our lives themselves expose the darkness in this world, because we stand as a stunning contrast against those in the community, against our co-workers. Always be ready. Always be faithful. Because you never know. You never know when you might take your last breath. And though I do not believe that God is the kind of God that hides behind a bush, just waiting for you to mess up to take you, that's an improper view of God. But why take the chance of taking a time off of faithfulness, being laxed in your efforts, being laxed in your diligence of study? You know, there are many things that can persuade us or allure us away. The things of this world, the pleasures of this world, even family, even our own physical family can take us away from our spiritual development. There needs to be a healthy balance. And I want to tell you, I'm going to make it real simple. God comes first. God comes first before you. God comes before your wife. God comes before your children, before your job. God comes first. You keep that order. You know, someone in preaching school, one of the instructor's wives spoke to the preacher's wives, and her acronym was JOY. Jesus first, others second, yourself last. That is how you can assure that you have true joy in life. You put God first, you put others second, and you put yourself last. Rejoice in our relationship with God, always. Be thankful for it. Philippians chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. Therefore, my beloved and longed for brethren, my joy and crown, so stand fast in the Lord. Stand fast in the Lord. And then he says, I implore Euodia and I implore Syntychia to be of the same mind in the Lord. And I urge you also, true companion, help these women who labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Faithfulness. They're laboring for the Lord. Paul is making mention of them. And now look what he says in verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I say, rejoice. We need to be a people grateful for this relationship that we have. Look at what verse 5 says. Because we have this joyful attitude of our relationship with God, let your gentleness be made known to all men. The Lord is at hand. Verse 6, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Verse 7, a wonderful passage. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. You see, that right there will help us to ensure that we are always faithful, that we are not jumping back and forth, hot and cold, on fire, not on fire for the Lord. Also, this evening, Christianity, besides faithfulness, it demands consistency. And we're going to be looking a little bit more into faithfulness, but Christianity is not a circumstantial religion. We do not reserve our faith. We do not take a step back based upon where we are at, the place that we find ourselves. We don't put on a face here and a different face at school, in the community, in our jobs. That's one thing about the Pharisees. They would stand up, and Jesus is kind of rebuking them in Matthew chapter 6, 2 through 5. How the Pharisees would stand in the middle of a crowd and begin to show his piety, show his religion. They were even guilty of painting their faces to make them look like they had been fasting even more. Even when invited to a place, we must be a people of God. Luke 14, 7 and following. We don't change who we are depending on where we're at, depending on what stimuli and what the circumstances is. But sadly, seasonal Christians, they're good in the presence of other Christians. But when they get around their co-workers and maybe some of their friends that they should have left, they become a completely different person. They begin to speak the crude jokes. They begin to dress and act like the world. They act different. And that's not how it should be. What about time? How should we change our Christianity based upon time? We shouldn't. The seasonal Christian, they are zealous, except when on vacation. They will be here every Sunday and Wednesday, but when they go on vacation, even if there is a faithful congregation right down the road, they won't go because it's inconvenient. The seasonal Christian serves well at worship, but not so much at the Bible class. Oh, that's just too early for me. I like to sleep in. Health is another issue. I'm not speaking about health getting in the way. I'm talking about, I just don't feel like it. I stayed up too late. I got to sleep in. The seasonal Christian remembers Christ on Sunday morning, but not Sunday night or Wednesday night. It's just too inconvenient. It demands too much. What about age? Oftentimes we can feel like, we're getting older. And I served God in my youth, but now I can retire in my age. I understand if you're slowing down. That's not the issue here. But oftentimes we have people that allow their age to completely take away from their faithfulness, from their devotion. In Psalm 71 and verse 18, the psalmist writes, "Now also when I am old and gray-headed, O God, do not forsake me until I declare your strength to this generation." You see, this psalmist wanted to make sure that he had enough breath left in him to declare God's righteousness, your power to everyone who is to come. He wanted to ensure, even in his old age, and even when he became older, that he would be able to declare to the younger generations about God's strength. In Joshua 14 and verse 10, we see that Joshua was 85 years old. Was he slowing down physically? Quite possibly. But was he allowing it to get in his way? No. He said, "I'm going to serve you with the same fervor as I began." And he did. Even if physically he was moving a little bit slower, within himself, he did not let his 85 years get in the way. What about weather? Too hot, too cold, a little bit of misting. If we're snowed in, that's one thing. If there's a tornado, that's one thing. But unfortunately, too many times, I see online congregations shutting down just because it's raining. We must be Christians in spite of weather. Oftentimes, with the idea of weather in our minds, oftentimes we are only Christians, yes, when it's convenient, but also when it is easy, when things are going our way. We're fair weather Christians. As long as things are going our way, then we will be faithful. Then we can be faithful. They are for the Lord. If it's not too hot, not too cold, they are for the Lord if things are going well for them. What about feelings? Regardless of our feelings, the seasonal Christian works when he feels fine but shrinks back if he has just the slightest tickle, a little tired. He steps back and he forsakes everything. He prays long and loud when ill, but forgets to pray. He forgets to do what he is called to do when he's well. We must not allow ourselves to become this fair weather Christian based upon either the weather outside or the weather inside. We all face different storms of life. During some of the most intense persecutions of the church, Acts 8 and verse 4 tells us that the church, as it was persecuted, it was scattered, but they went everywhere preaching the gospel. Even when we hear difficult truths, even when we have our toes stepped on, our hearts pricked, even when we may not agree with the Scripture, are we going to be faithful? Are we going to allow it to change our lives even if we don't agree with it? Because eventually you need to get to a point to where you do agree with it. Because God knows better. There in John 6 and verse 68, after Jesus spoke some difficult things, some things that people did not understand right away. They didn't understand the full extent of what Jesus was talking about. Maybe some did. But they said that this is a hard saying. Who can hear it? Who can accept it? And people are beginning to disperse, and Jesus' disciples or his apostles are kind of away from Christ, and Jesus turns back toward them and he goes, "Are you too going to leave me?" But Peter oftentimes is the first one to open his mouth and the last one to close it. Opens his mouth and he says something very insightful and meaningful. Where else would we go? You have the words of life. And the Greek basically means you alone have the words of life. Where else would they go? Where else could they